I'm delighted to say that we are now joined by Rutger Bregman, who's written a book that I would strongly recommend, that was sent to me a couple of months back. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History, and it will make you both hopeful and enlightened. Rutger, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's ask the sort of perennial lockdown question. Where are you locked down and how is it going?
So I live in a small place called Houten. It's a little bit to the south of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And, it's a lovely, boring place. It's a very weird experience doing a book tour remotely, right? Just staying in the same
better
home.
or worse?
Yeah. I can't admit that I rather like it. I can't deny, that I rather like it. Because I don't like the traveling of a normal
You don't
book.
have to leave your house.
Yeah, it's very efficient.
And is it quite strict, the lockdown where you are? Are people observing it?
Well, our prime minister calls it an intelligent lockdown that we have. So
that sounds very Dutch.
Yeah, it's a very Dutch, very smart PR move. No, but I mean, it's not as strict as in Spain or in Italy, but it is stricter than in, say, Sweden, I think. Restaurants are closed, cafes are closed, but then many shops are open. I don't know. I think it's quite similar to what's going on in the UK, I guess.
Now let's talk about your book. I think to start with, I said it's very uplifting. Tell us, or rather our listeners, your argument about, which is really an argument about human nature, set out in the book, and how this differs from what we so often hear, and we'll come to some of the stories we hear.
Yeah, so there's an old idea within Western culture, and this goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. And the idea is that civilization is only a thin veneer, right? And as soon as something happens, say a natural disaster, or you shipwreck on an island, or you're suddenly left on your own, that people reveal their true selves, right? When civilization is gone, we reveal that actually we are animals, monsters. Deep down, we're all selfish. Now, this is a really powerful, deeply embedded idea in Western culture. The ancient Greeks had it. It was with the Christian church fathers, St. Augustine, the idea that we're all born as sinners. If you read many of the Enlightenment philosophers, whether it's David Hume or Thomas Hobbes or Adam Smith, you also keep finding this idea that deep down we're all selfish. And if you think about the ideology that basically governed our society for the past 40 years, ever since the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, that many people call neoliberalism. Well, what is the central dogma of neoliberals? It's most people are selfish. Deal with it and design your whole society around that idea. So that's really where I start the book. I basically try to show that veneer theory is utterly, completely wrong. There's a huge amount of scientific evidence that actually when people shipwreck on an island, or when there's a natural disaster, when people are suddenly, in this crisis, then you get an explosion of altruism and cooperation.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you talk early in the book about The Lord of the Flies, the William Golding novel. And in a way, that's quite a good maybe starting point, isn't it? Because there's The Lord of the Flies, and then there's a sort of real life example. Yeah,
it's one of the classic examples of veneer theory. A couple of kids are in an airplane crash, and end up on this uninhabited island. And at first they try sort of setting up a democracy of sorts, but it doesn't really work out. And at the end of the novel, 3 of them are dead, and then they've gone nuts and crazy. It's horrible tribal behavior. And the message of the novel was, look, here you have nicely well-behaved British boys from a very good boarding school, but you leave them on an island, and this is what happens, And it was also seen as sort of an explanation for the horrors of the 20th century. How do we explain the Holocaust? How do we explain the Second World War? Well, there's a Nazi in each and every one of us. William Golding, the author of Lord of the Flies, said that himself. That he said, I understand the Nazis because I am of that sort by nature. I remember reading this book, Lord of the Flies, when I was 16 or 17 years old. And it was like this coming of age experience, right? I think many people have had this, that you get this feeling like, okay, no more Harry Potter from me. You know, now this is like a real story, how real kids would actually behave. And I remember being a little bit depressed, but also thought, you know, this is probably true. It was only years later that I thought, you know, has this ever actually been tried? You know, has there ever been a scientific experiment, you know, where they would actually drop kids on an island and see what will happen?
And tell us give us the denouement.
Yeah, so obviously you ask around a little bit among your friends with kids. I don't have kids myself, and you ask, you know, would you be willing to sign up for this experiment? And then you quickly realize, you know, no one wants to do that. But then I wondered, you know, has there ever been a natural experiment, right? That just by accident, maybe it happened sometime in world history that kids, you know, would just shipwreck on an island, and then maybe you could study that. So I'm a proper investigative journalist, and I started Googling, and, you know, just looking for things like children on an island, real life Lord of the Flies. And after a while, I stumbled upon an anecdote on some obscure blog that told this story that supposedly this had happened in 1977, that kids from a boarding school in Tonga, which is an island group in the Pacific Ocean, had shipwrecked on a small island called Ata, and that they had survived there for more than a year and had been rescued by a captain, and that they supposedly had stayed friends all this time. You know, very hopeful, uplifting story. So I was very enthusiastic about this, obviously. But then when I started, you know, researching this more, I, you know, kept finding the same anecdote, the same words. So after a couple of weeks, I thought, you know, this is probably just some story that people tell on the internet, you know, and that goes viral every now and then. But that actually didn't really happen, right? It was just by pure accident, actually pure luck, that after a while I was looking for articles, you know, from the 1970s that could maybe confirm whether this really happened. And by accident, I was looking in the 1960s. And then suddenly I saw that it actually did happen, but not in 1977. That was a typo, but it did happen in 1966. So I had this article from The Age, an Australian newspaper, that said that 6 kids had just been rescued from an island by the captain named Peter Warner. And then I thought, you know, maybe these people are still alive, right? It was 2017, and I thought, you know, the captain must be around 90 years old by now. I mean, he could still be alive, and the kids should be around 70, right? And there were 6 of them, so maybe I can find them. And pure luck would have it that I was about to go on a book tour to Australia to, you know, talk about my previous book, Utopia for Realists. So I said to my publisher, you know, can I have a couple of days off? Because after a while, you know, people are really helpful. So you just email and a couple of people, and then after a long chain of emails, you finally get the address of this old captain. And we drove there, my wife and I, and we met him. And he told the story of what really happened in the real life Lord of the Flies. And I can assure you that if this would be a movie or, you know, some Hollywood epic, people would say, this is terrible. You know, this is worse than Love Actually. You know, this is the most sentimental, unrealistic, naive presentation.
And it was nothing like the Lord of the Flies, basically. They looked after each other, all of the positive things that you would hope for.
Yeah. It's really, the real Lord of the Flies is a story of friendship and resilience and loyalty and comradeship. It's like in every single way, it's the opposite of the fictional Lord of the Flies. They get the fire started after a couple of months, and they never let it go out, you know, for more than a year. And they have this very smart way of organizing themselves. They work in pairs of 2, right? 2 to guard, 2 to cook, 2 to tend to the garden. Sometimes they're in fights, but then what happens is that one of the boys would go to one side of the island, and the other will go to the other side of the island. They would cool off a little bit, then come back, cry a little bit, and say sorry. And, you know, I can't help it. It's really sentimental, but that's how it actually happened.
Rutger, can I ask you to tell us about the idea of Homo Puppy?
Yeah,
that
sure.
you introduce in the book?
Sure. So one of the reasons that I started writing this book is that I got the impression that something exciting was going on in science in the past 15 to 20 years. So scientists from very diverse disciplines, sociologists, anthropologists, biologists, archaeologists, you name it, have all been moving from a quite cynical view of human nature to a much more hopeful, optimistic view of human nature. And one of the best examples is what happened in evolutionary biology. You know, when I first learned of evolution theory, I thought it was quite depressing, even though realistic idea, right? We all know Richard Dawkins' famous book, The Selfish Gene, right? That if you read reviews on Amazon of that book, there are many people saying, oh, this is such a good book, but I wish I never read it because now I'm so depressed, right? And he has this line somewhere in the book where he says, you know, we just got to teach people generosity and altruism because we are born selfish, right? That's just who we are. So another expression of this veneer theory. Now, actually, biology has been moving in a very different direction in the past 10 to 20 years. What biologists now believe is actually that for thousands of years, it was the friendliest among us who had the most kids and still had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. They literally talk about survival of the friendliest. And now why did this happen? Well, actually, because sort of being friendly is our big evolutionary advantage. It means that we can cooperate on a scale that no other animal in the animal kingdom can do, right? So we have all kinds of peculiar features. For example, we're the only species in the animal kingdom that blush, which is really weird, right? Why would you blush? Why would you involuntarily give away your feelings to someone else? I mean, it's not very Machiavellian. But we do it because it helps us to cooperate and to trust each other. And this is really the central thing that you got to know about human beings, is that we have been designed by evolution to trust each other most of the time. And that is why we built pyramids and castles and musea while the Neanderthals are on display there instead of the other way around. So that is a really, really exciting and I think important finding from biology.
I mean, I think what is so exciting about your book is that you methodically go through so many of the sort of examples, the scientific experiments, the things that are supposed to show that people are fundamentally bad, to say, and you sort of do a process of debunking, and show that you know, and I won't go through the whole long list, but you know that the experiment was not what it was said to be, or you know when it's re-examined, it shows something different. So, having said all that, then why do we have this negative view of human nature?
Okay, I think there are a couple of important reasons. So on the surface, you obviously have the information system, right? The kind of information that we consume on a daily basis, which is the news, right? And we all know the news is mostly about the negative, right? Corruption, violence, terrorism. So if you watch a lot of the news, at the end of the day, you know exactly how the world doesn't work. But then if you go a little bit deeper than that, and you ask the question, who benefits from this cynical view of human nature? The answer is quite simple. It is those in power benefit, right? Because if we cannot trust each other, then we need them. Then we need the generals and the monarchs and the kings and the queens and you name it to keep us in check, right? So this classic Hobbesian view that if people were free, you would get this war of all against all is also a classic conservative argument, and it's an argument for hierarchy. And this is also why the argument that I make in my book, that people are actually pretty decent, is a really dangerous idea. People may think, oh, there's a nice warm book about some warm, nice idea, you know, the power of kindness. Well, actually, if you really think it through, it means revolution, right? It means we can organize our society in a completely different way. And I think this is also the reason why throughout history, those who have advocated a more hopeful view of human nature have often been persecuted, right? Whether you think about the 19th century anarchists, you know, Kropotkin, Emma Goldman, and the many examples who had a more realistic, hopeful view of human nature, but, you know, were followed around the globe by the Secret Service and those in power because they understood that this view of human nature is really dangerous.
I think, Geoff, shall I hand over to you for four?
Yes. So let's talk about how we square this positive view of human nature with the fact that people also do terrible things at the most excessive: war, genocide, murder, etc.
Well, this is obviously the big question that hangs over this whole project and this whole book, right? How can you ever write a book about human kindness and human cooperation, all those wonderful things, when we are clearly also the cruelest species in the whole animal kingdom, right? I've never heard of a penguin that says, oh, let's look up another group of penguins, right, and exterminate them and kill them. It's like a typically human thing to do. So I obviously, I mean, I can't this is one of the big questions of history anyway. So I can only sort of give I think a beginning of an answer here. But if we, for example, look at this new theory from biologists, right, that we have evolved to be friendly and work together, I think we have to recognize that there's also a dark side to friendliness, to loyalty, and to comradeship. The dark side is tribal behavior or groupish behavior, right? That people find it very hard to go against the group or against the status quo, even when history is moving in a horrible, terrible direction, right? In the book, I give the example of the German Wehrmacht, the German army during the Second World War. And, one of the fascinating things is that it was the most powerful fighting force probably throughout history, right? It was incredibly effective. Historians later estimated that, a German soldier was on average 50% more effective than an Allied soldier in terms of, casualties. But then they kept fighting in 1944 and 1945. And the question is why? It was clear that they were losing, right? The Russians were coming in the east, especially after D-Day. It was a lost cause for the Germans, but they were fighting harder than ever. And the Allied psychologists thought that it was because they were so brainwashed, right? That they were just had this maniac ideology and that they were fighting for that. But then they started interviewing prisoners of war, and they suddenly discovered that they had it all wrong. That actually, the powerful ingredient that made Germans fight harder than all the others was comradeship. They were really fighting for their friends, and that kept coming up in interview after interview. And which is, I don't know, it's a very uncomfortable, dark finding that so often things that we consider as good, right? Loyalty, comradeship, friendship, are also often implicated in our most horrible crimes.
And you also write about this hormone that people know as the love hormone, oxytocin, which, you say people refer to as the milk of human kindness, but there could be a dark side to this too. Yeah.
So initially people were like really happy when they discovered that if you spray a little bit of oxytocin down people's nose and they get all these warm feelings, right? It seems like perfect for a good date or something like that, if you want a nice night out. But then later, psychologists discovered that actually oxytocin also increases feelings of tribal behavior. You start liking your own group more and disliking the other group, right? So this is often sort of intimately connected. There's also a great thinker on this is Paul Bloom, the psychologist, who warns about the dangers of empathy, right? He's written this brilliant book called Against Empathy, where he sort of shows that the other side of the coin, when we talk about empathy, is xenophobia, right? You see this in so many of conflicts around the globe. Think about, classic example is Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? There's an attack, a lot of empathy on one side for the victims, then the call for vengeance, attack on the other side, blah, 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 and goes on and on and on. So often in the Middle East, we have too much empathy, right? And we would benefit from zooming out a little bit more and a more detached rationality or compassion or something like that.
Rutger, before we go on to your sort of recommendations flowing from the thesis that you advance in the book, can I ask you sort of another question about the sort of the kind of the thesis itself? Mm-hmm. Because I mean, this sort of occurred to me as I was reading the book. Is one plausible explanation for some of what we observe in crises moments? So you talk about, Britain during the Blitz, well, as well as Germany, actually, mm-hmm. When it was being bombed, or when natural disasters happen. Is one of the reasons for this that the sort of background ethos of the society, of our society, mm-hmm. is a very competitive, very capitalistic, very atomistic ethos, mm-hmm. which pushes people in a certain direction. But at times of crisis, in some sense, those imperatives are sort of removed and fade into the background. Mm-hmm. And that, in a sense, liberates the sort of, essential decency of people.
Yeah. Well, I sort of have a double idea about this. So on the one hand, I think that what you assume in other people is what you get out of them, right? So often your view of human nature can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And, you know, if you really think that people deep down are all selfish, then you'll design your institutions around that idea. You know, you get a particular kind of boarding school, for example, or a kind of, you know, organization that's really about cutthroat competition. You know, think about the London financial sector, so many other examples, and sort of you get the kind of people that your theory presupposes. And obviously the argument that I make is that we can turn it around, right? If we design our society with institutions that really assume that most people are not selfish but want to cooperate, then that's the kind of people that we're going to get. But at the same time, I'm also saying that the latter would also be the more natural way to go. You could say it as in this way: human beings have two legs, right? We stand on two legs. We have a social leg and a selfish leg, but we sort of have a natural preference for a social leg, right? Sort of often competition and selfishness are highly unnatural for us, and we also pay a price for it, right? Loneliness, for example, we know that loneliness is similar to smoking 50 cigarettes a day, right? It's really unhealthy. Your body sort of says, no, we don't want that. If you think about violence is psychologically actually really hard for us to do. You know, we've been brainwashed by, you know, decades of Hollywood movies and series like Game of Thrones, which give us the impression that it's really easy to shove down a sword at someone, right? Actually, it's almost impossible for most of us. So if you look at the history of warfare, most killing actually happens from a distance, right? It's relatively easy to push a button and then let a bomb explode somewhere far away, right? But it's almost impossible psychologically for most average people to use a bayonet, for example. If you look at wounds after famous battles like the Battle of Waterloo or the Battle of the Somme, almost no bayonets were used because people really couldn't do it. You know, there are military historians who describe situations where sort of two armies advance and at some point they realize, oh God, shit, we have to use bayonets. And this historian says, you know, usually one or two of the armies would remember an urgent appointment somewhere else, would just leave, or at least use the other side of the bayonet, because it's really it's a fascinating thing that you go through all these musea and look at these bayonets, and you can be sure that most of them have never been used because people just can't do it. Now, obviously, again, a horrible fact about us is that we can overcome this natural urge against violence, right? We can use technological means, you know, with guns or artillery or whatever, and also psychological means to increase the distance with other people, right? We can dehumanize other people. We can condition and brainwash soldiers, etc., etc. But then if we do that, and we've really seen, for example, the American military getting way better at this in the 20th century, then often people pay a price for that. So, for example, soldiers who went to Vietnam have been often brainwashed and conditioned to really shoot at the enemy. But then many of them came back with PTSD. And there's a huge amount of evidence that killing in a war is really damaging to your own psychological health, which suggests to me that this is not sort of what we're meant to do. You know, we're not by evolution designed sort of to kill other people. Actually, you find it really hard.
So if there was a widespread reframing across politics about how we see people, if we started with the assumption that human nature is good, what would the implications of that be on different policies like education or criminal justice?
So many things to say about this. Maybe we should start with the recognition that, yes, most people are pretty decent, but on the other hand, power corrupts. So this is something that nomadic hunter-gatherers already knew, you know, for thousands of years, is that power is an incredibly dangerous drug. There's now evidence from neurology, from psychology, you name it, that those who have, you know, really used this drug too much, like if you put them in a brain scanner, it looks as if their brain is damaged, right? Like someone hit them on the head, or as if they were born as a sociopath or something like that.
I mean, this is a warning about the Geoffocracy, Geoff, let me say.
Power would not corrupt me.
We have a thing in the podcast called the Geoffocracy, Rutger. I think it's an important warning to Geoff.
I would be the exception that proves the rule of power corrupting.
Well, anyway, carry on, Rutger.
No, you can think about, for example, some of the world leaders right now, whether you think about Trump or Bolsonaro, and then imagine them in prehistory, right? Being part of a hunter-gatherer tribe. They would die really quickly, because the group wouldn't like them. They would be shamed. Then it turns out that they couldn't blush, which wouldn't be good for them either. And then they would be expelled and die alone, right? While now we have a society where you don't have survival of the friendliest, but often survival of the shameless, right? So this is really an indictment of the so-called democratic system that we have right now, is that actually being shameless has become a political advantage, right? And that really should make us question, what's going on here? How is it possible that this system that we call democracy actually benefits those who are without shame? I think that if we sort of update our view of human nature to a more realistic one, and then think about how we should design our democracy, it becomes obvious that it should become a much more participatory democracy, where power is much more distributed than it is right now. And there have been experiments since the 80s, really started in Latin America, with participatory budgeting, for example, or other kinds of participatory democracy, where you just randomly choose civilians from the population to become politician for a year. And I think that's a good direction of thought, and we should experiment with that way more. It really starts with the recognition that power corrupts.
And would that be in the form of things like citizens' assemblies?
Yes. I think that's an excellent direction. This is also partly the reason why I wrote the book, because I started to understand that so many of the exciting ideas that are in the air right now, whether you talk about citizen assemblies or about universal basic income, my previous book was about that. I started to understand that all these ideas presuppose a completely different view of human nature. And then I realized back in 2015, when I started writing this book, is that I personally didn't have that view of human nature. I had studied history, so obviously I was, a bit more cynical. And I wondered, if I sort of could make the argument that actually it could also be realistic and rational to hope for the best in other people.
And on something like universal basic income, which we've talked about a lot in the past on the podcast, how is that connected to your theme of humankind and the decency of people?
Well, what I experienced, and I think we talked about this the last time as well when I was on your podcast, is I was mainly talking about all these scientific experiments, right? That happened ever since the 1970s in Canada and the US and so many other places. We've recently got this new report out from Finland that shows some really good results. Turns out, no, people are not massively lazy, don't stop working. There's actually a mild positive effect on employment, and people's well-being increases, et cetera, et cetera. So I went on a book tour and always giving all these examples, like, look, people, it actually works. But then again and again, after 30 or 40 minutes, I found myself in a very different discussion. People were not interested in the scientific evidence anymore. They would say, well, that's just, maybe that happens on a local scale, or maybe in this particular period in history in that small experiment. But in the end, human nature, right? Deep down, people are just selfish. People are lazy. That's what you have to deal with. And that is why basic income is never going to work, because it assumes a completely unrealistic view of human nature. So that's when I realized that I shouldn't have written another book first, right? Before I could talk about things like basic income. You really have to start at the beginning with how do you actually look at other people?
And really, I think that's what's so interesting, is you've gone to the sort of roots of some of these ideas that you were putting forward in Utopia for Realists, because you've got to sort of persuade people on the roots of what sort of lies beneath these ideas.
Yeah. I've got a question for you, by the way.
Yeah.
Because, I've been a couple of times to the UK now to promote my previous book, Utopia for Realists, and obviously to talk about other ideas. And, the more time I spend discussing these ideas with British journalists or thinkers or whatever, the more I got the impression that the UK is a much more hierarchical society than the Netherlands is, right? It seems to me that it's not a coincidence that Lord of the Flies is a British novel, right? But it's British boarding school culture. One of the really striking findings I thought that I stumbled upon during my research is the psychology of bullying, right? I used to believe that bullying is just sort of this natural thing of, human nature. It just happens in every society. That's what I thought. But then actually, if you look at the psychology and sociology of bullying, you discover that bullying is really the product of very specific circumstances and institutions. It's what they call so-called total institutions. And a total institution is a little bit a place like Hogwarts in Harry Potter, right? It's like this boarding school that you can't get out of only during summer and Christmas, where they have a competitive system, set up different groups against each other, et cetera, et cetera. It's like the perfect recipe for bullying. But then you think about it and you think, well, that is actually a highly unnatural state of affairs, right? And you look at nomadic hunter-gatherers and how they organize education. They don't organize it at all, obviously, because they think that play and learning is the same thing. And you see that there's hardly any bullying happening there among children. So what do you think about that? Am I onto something here or not?
I think you're onto something. I'll let that hang in the air. But I think you're. I think you're onto something. I mean, I wanted to ask you about the current crisis. And I suppose in a way this conversation sort of reinforces in my mind that we have to be careful about the way we describe this response to crisis, because I suppose what I take from your book is that our default is to describe the positive solidaristic response to the crisis as somehow a sort of exceptional behavior in people, whereas your argument is it's natural behavior in people.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about what you think about the current crisis and sort of how it relates to your thesis.
Yeah. So the big question right now is the shock doctrine or a paradise built in hell. So to explain that, the shock doctrine, a book by Naomi Klein, the great Canadian author, who basically made the argument that crises are often abused by those in power to basically grab more power. And the book is a history of neoliberalism in which she shows how crises have always been abused in this way. And then the other book is by Rebecca Solnit, A Paradise Built in Hell, in which she describes how people respond, how average people on the ground, bottom up, respond to disasters. And she talks about the huge amount of sociological evidence we have ever since the 1960s. Got more than 700 case studies now that show that every single time you've got a disaster like this, you get this explosion of altruism, right? So that's the big question. And the future is, I think, completely uncertain. There are signs that the world's dominant ideology that governed the world for the past 40 years is breaking right now. I mean, you've probably seen this Financial Times editorial from the beginning of April, right? Where the Financial Times, the world's biggest business paper, is talking about how we need to take ideas like taxing the wealthy and basic income, etc., more seriously. I couldn't believe my eyes when I was reading that. I mean, it was just a couple of years ago that they were going nuts about Piketty and sort of trying to describe him as a sort of a fraudulent economist or something like that. And now you can clearly see that sort of the ideas that used to be dismissed as unreasonable or unrealistic, right, that have been advocated in the past couple of years by people like Mariana Mazzucato, Thomas Piketty, Greta Thunberg, Andrew Yang in the US, they're all moving into the mainstream right now. And if you look at polls, there was just this poll that came out, I think this week, where they discovered that 70% of Europeans now think a universal basic income is a good idea. So yeah, there's a real opportunity there for radical change as well. And I have no clue in which direction we're going right now.
Well, that's all up to us, I suppose. Look,
yeah.
Rutger, I really want to thank you for joining us. The book is Humankind, A Hopeful History. It is published next week on the 19th of May. I can't, as I said at the outset, I really strongly recommend this book. I think I would have been recommending it anyway, but particularly at this moment when we all need reasons to be cheerful and reasons for hope, it is a very hopeful book. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.